Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our series of videos about great ideas in psychology. In the first part, we covered the introduction to the series, what great ideas are, why they are worthy of attention. In the second part, we talked about experimentation in psychology, the psychological laboratory, its application, and its possible criticism. In this part, the third part in the series, we are going to talk about the placebo effect. And obviously, we're not going to have a complete and conclusive discussion about the placebo. We are just going to initiate thinking and talking about it in the context of psychology. This is hopefully going to be a course about psychological ideas, not in the context of medicine. So we are going to talk about why it is relevant to psychology, why it should be considered as an important psychological concept, placebo. All right, let me start sharing my screen and the slides. Here we are, the cover of the book by Fatali Moghadam, Great Ideas in Psychology, A Cultural and Historical Introduction, Part 3, The Placebo Effect. And this is where we are in the general plan of the series of videos. We are just beginning the series. And now at the placebo, next time, we are going to get to the unconscious, the Freudian unconscious. In this video, I'm going to address three questions. What is the placebo effect? Kind of definition of it. We're going to talk about its reality. Is it a real effect? Should we believe in it? How should we think about it? And why is it a great idea? So let's begin with kind of casual definition. The placebo effect is the beneficial effect of a medical procedure, or in general, a procedure that itself should not have a physical or physiological impact. So taken in isolation, that procedure, we don't expect from it to do anything. So that taking a medicine, it's a so-called sugar pill. It's a pill that has no relevant medical substance in it, or medically relevant substance in that pill. Or we could think about the procedure of having a visit with the doctor. That visit on its own, we don't expect usually any impact from it. Even though it might have an impact. So the effect is observed, the placebo effect is observed because the patient believes that it will work. That's the way we usually think about the placebo effect. And it is an implicit part of research, medical research, experimental research on new treatments that people want to test the effectiveness of a new treatment. Usually when people design experimental trials, they include a control condition and they compare the effectiveness of a new treatment against that control condition. And they use placebo as another word for the control condition. And obviously, I mean, it's ideally the design is double blind. Doubly blind, it means that neither the researchers who are administering the treatments, neither they nor the patients know who belongs to which group, who is in the control group or the placebo group, and who is in the treatment group or the experimental group. Why do I say that the concept of the placebo effect is implicit? It's tacitly enacted by people who conduct these kinds of clinical trials. Because the assumption that is built into these trials is that there might already be some effect in the placebo group. And we should consider a drug as effective if it has an effect that is above and beyond the placebo effect. So because of that expectation, and that is another reason why double-blind design is preferred. In this chapter, if you read the chapter, you will see mention of some landmark papers related to the placebo effect. Henry Beecher in 1955 reviewed the clinical research of his time and concluded that 35% of patients improve only due to the placebo effect. A few decades later, Kirsch and Saperstein argued that in antidepressant medications, 75% of the improvements in those patients is because of the placebo effect. That's a really large portion. And there are authors who have argued that the placebo effect doesn't exist. Now, the author of our text, Professor Moghadam, says that we should consider a couple of factors when we decide whether or not something is a placebo effect or whether or not there's a genuine placebo effect in a given situation. These are two factors. One is the natural course of the illness itself. So left to their own, patients might recover. So there's a time course from getting ill, recovering, and then completely getting over the illness, becoming healthy again. That should be distinguished from any effect that we might call placebo. That's one. The other one is the behavioral change or possible behavioral changes as a result of procedures. So a behavioral change is not necessarily what we want to call placebo because it's just a change in behavior. It might lead to some other beneficial effects because the behavior is healthy and it might result in health-related benefits. But itself, we should probably distinguish it from placebo effects. Behavioral changes arise from the fact that we generally want to act congruently, act in harmony with our social rules, with the social rules that are attributed to us. So if I am labeled as a sick person, if I'm labeled with an illness, then I, without really wanting or without consciously deciding, I start behaving in a way that is congruent with my social position as a sick person. It's because we're always embedded in a cultural, social setting. We're always embedded, and we unintentionally and not fully consciously, we act in a way that fulfills our social position, our social role. So if somebody calls me not a sick person, but somebody who is recovering, somebody's close to recovering, then I might start behaving differently in a way that is matching my new label. So that's what our author here means by behavioral changes. People who are labeled sick or people who are labeled recovering take on the expected behavior. Then the author talks about types of placebo, and I kind of suggest a very small modification to these labels. So let's go through them. Inactive placebo is when the placebo doesn't have any physiological change, doesn't actually change anything in the body, physically in the body. And then we have the negative active placebo. That is when there is a physiological change, but that is not relevant to the disease that is of interest to us. So let's say, for example, somebody has MS, multiple sclerosis, or Parkinson's disease. They go through a placebo procedure, and it doesn't really affect anything that, in a way, anything related to the disease, but it might result in boosting their general energy or improving their appetite, or something that is not directly related to the disease, but it's a physiological change and results in some kind of improvement in their overall state, overall well-being. That's negative active placebo. I prefer to call that indirect active placebo, but that's just my minor suggestion in the terminology. Positive active placebo is when there is a physiological change and it is relevant to the disease under study. And here I prefer, instead of positive, using the word direct active placebo. The example, this very important example that is included in the chapter is a study published in 2001 in Science, in the journal Science, by Fuente Fernandez and colleagues. They studied the placebo effect in Parkinson's disease and found that patients who go through that placebo treatment, in that area of their brain that is relevant to Parkinson's disease, that area is called striatum. In their striatum, the brain starts to release dopamine. So they suffer from a shortage. The disease is related to a shortage of dopamine especially in that area of the brain striatum. And the placebo treatment triggers endogenous release of dopamine in those patients. You might ask, if this positive active placebo causing that kind of physiological change, why is it not called just a drug? Why is it still called a placebo? The reason is that in that word endogenous, it is the body itself that is doing the work, not the drug. It is not a pharmaceutical intervention. It is a psychological intervention, and the body is endogenously doing the physiological change. This is the image from the study, PET scan. There are, of course, just because we say that an effect is real doesn't mean that it is without limits. There are limits to the placebo effect. For example, there's evidence that the placebo effect is powerless in the case of cancerous disease like brain tumors. So to talk about the placebo, we are almost forced to talk about meaning of events. And that's why I think the placebo effect is an extremely important concept in psychology, because it brings to our attention the domain of meaning and the meaning of events and how we attribute meaning to life events. And the same life event could have different meanings. And because of those meanings, we might react to it differently, both with our actions and with our physiology. To understand meaning, consider this example. This is just, I'm going to just highlight that domain of or dimension of meaning. Imagine the same feeling of sickness in two cases. In one case, that feeling of sickness follows getting a vaccine shot. In the second case, it follows being exposed to somebody who has COVID-19 or you think has COVID-19. Now imagine that's the same feeling of sickness, but because of its context, because of the surrounding events or events around it, it takes different meaning. In one case, it is relatively unthreatening completely. You're not worried about it because it is about the vaccine and your natural reaction to the vaccine. In the other case, it is worrying. It's relatively more worrying because it is, you think it might be because of the exposure to an infected person. So that's what I mean when I talk about the difference in meaning of events. I think that is a helpful kind of example. So placebo effect is closely tied to meaning. And what kind of meaning? Could be a kind of meaning associated with being treated with care by another human being who we trust. That is probably also important. So being treated with care and being attended to by a person who has some knowledge and skill related to health, that could be a source of change. It's a case where psychologically we go through something and that affects our body, affects the physiology of our body because of that relationship, because of the meaning of that event. That is why, by the way, similar effects have been observed in animals too. We can't necessarily call them the exact same kind of placebo effect, but when animals are cared for, when they're attended to, when they're just, somebody pays attention to them, their immune system, there's evidence that the immune system improves. They respond better to sickness. So the animals, we can't say the animal believes in the effectiveness of the placebo effect because they have talked about it, they have listened to the anticipated effects. No, it is that primal, more basic experience of receiving attention and care in the case of animals, non-human animals that care from a human. The author in this chapter also talks about some of the negative consequences of the placebo, including maybe becoming too dependent on placebo drugs. He talks about the possibility of getting addicted to them. And it's a kind of, I think we can say it's a psychological addiction. And towards the end of this passage, if you read the last sentence, it's another kind of vulnerability. You become susceptible to fraud. So kind of belief in extraordinary effects like the placebo. It might open up the door to all kinds of fraudulent practices and to so-called healers who may do more harm than good. Clearly, they do a lot of financial harm, but they might also do harm to our health because of what they might recklessly do to the body. All right, some final words related to this topic. What is the placebo effect? I think now we can continue asking this question in a more informed way, and we're prepared to read about it, to think about it further if you're interested in it. And we should ask, when we talk about the placebo effect, what are we talking about? Do we mean that there is an effect of nothing? Is the placebo effect an effect that comes from nothing? And I want to say that that's a wrong way of thinking about it. And the vacuity, the emptiness of this term itself, the placebo, doesn't specify the source of the effect, the cause. It doesn't pinpoint anything. It's an effect that hasn't been accounted for, maybe. I would argue that it's not an effect of nothing. We shouldn't think about it as an effect of nothing. Instead, we should think of it as an effect that brings to our view, brings to our attention the reality of the psychological dimension, the reality of the dimension of meaning, the meaning that we attribute. And based on those meanings, we react differently to events. That's a different way of thinking compared to if we call it the effect of nothing. We should say, what is it that we are neglecting when we just expect pharmaceutical interventions to have real effects? That we shouldn't expect any real consequence if we are not changing the chemistry of the body, if you're not introducing a chemical intervention. So that's a bias. That's a kind of maybe pharmaceutical or chemical bias that we have. And it excludes from our consideration psychological interventions like reduction in stress or being cared for by other people, including by people who have expertise in health. So those are the final words. If you like this series, if you find it useful, please support the channel, help the channel with the YouTube algorithm by liking the video, by commenting, by subscribing. And if you like to more seriously support the channel, please take a look at my Patreon. There are some opportunities there for joining ongoing discussion groups, reading groups, writing groups that you might be interested in joining them. Otherwise, in the next part in the series, we are going to go through the Freudian unconscious. And if you want to prepare for next Tuesday, take a look at the Freudian unconscious, chapter 4 in our text. All right, that's it for now. Thank you for your attention, and we will continue, as I said, next Tuesday. Till next time.